everyone, and thanks again for joining us at the 2024 Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. My name is Jacob Harrison, and I'm a first-year MBA candidate at MIT Sloan, and it's my pleasure to introduce our panel, Behind the Scenes in Sports Negotiating, What the Fans and Media Don't Get to See. Our panelists today are Lindsey, Senior Advisor at the Dallas Mavericks, Daryl Morey, President of Basketball Operations for the Philadelphia 76ers, Nico Harrison, General Manager and Vice President of Basketball Ops for the Dallas Mavericks, and Monte McNair, General Manager of the Sacramento Kings. Our panel will be moderated by Deepak Malhotra, Professor at the Harvard Business School. This panel will run for 45 minutes and we'll leave 10 minutes at the end for audience questions. Please submit questions via the Cadence app. You can navigate to this panel via the schedule pane in the menu and navigate to the panel Behind the Scenes in Sports Negotiating. Questions can be submitted at that event and then will be selected by the moderator. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Deepak.
Thanks, Jacob. Good morning, everyone. I am honored and delighted to be here with all of you, not just this esteemed group of panelists, but all of you. I know there's a lot of things you can be doing on a Saturday morning, and you chose to spend it with us, and we're going to try to make it worth your while. The idea behind this session basically came out of a conversation I had with Daryl a few months ago, where we were talking about how often it is that there is a discrepancy between what fans want to see happen and what actually happens. What the sports journalists are saying should happen and the decisions that these folks actually make. And it's not uncommon that fans are annoyed, frustrated, disappointed, bewildered, or angry about the decisions that are being made that seem completely irrational. And one hypothesis is that if people could really see what is happening behind the scenes, what's really getting these decisions to be made in the way that they are, perhaps that discrepancy would be a little bit smaller. And that's what we're going to try to do today, because sometimes what looks like irrational behavior from a distance, when you get a little bit closer, you realize is something a little bit different. Irrational would be somebody doing something that, knowingly doing something that goes against their own self-interest. Usually, at least in my experience, what looks like irrational behavior is one of three other things. It may look irrational to us, but really what's going on is that these people have interests that are a little different than we expect. They have interests that we don't fully appreciate. They're optimizing for something a little bit different than we would want them to optimize for. A second possibility is it's not irrational, they just have certain constraints that we don't have good visibility on. There's pressures, their hands are tied in certain ways that we can't tell, but they're aware of. And finally, another explanation for what might look like irrational behavior is that there is an information gap. They happen to know certain things that we just don't know. Of course, it could go the other way around as well. The median fan might know something that these folks haven't considered, but we'll put that as a possibility as well. So what we're going to do is, in this panel, is starting out, explore each of these buckets, each of these possible explanations for why there might be a discrepancy between what the fans want to see or expect to happen, or what actually ends up happening. The constraints, the interest, and the information gap. And then we'll do some different things as we go farther along. I'm going to start out with Monty, and I'm going to ask him to just reflect on negotiations that you've been a part of, player negotiations, trade negotiations, where there's constraints that you're facing that might not be visible to the people on the outside or that people might not appreciate fully.
Yeah, I think one big one is that we're all on any decision is trying to resist the urge to just win the press conference, which is the easiest thing. Like release that pressure, do maybe the popular thing the fans want or the media is going to fawn over, get a draft grade, which I know Daryl loves to talk about. We've done some things that didn't win the press conference, but the freeing thing I think for us is at the end of the day, fans just want to win. Media just is going to respect if you win, and so if you win enough in the long term, they'll go back and maybe change that grade.
Okay, so there's a difference between pressure to do something right now and show some results, some forward movement, versus a long-term strategy that might make you do something different.
And Monty, they might literally go back and change the grade.
Other constraints.
Inside joke for the audience.
Constraints that you've dealt with that you don't think people fully appreciate.
Constraints for me? Oh, I thought it was. Yeah, so thank you. Sorry, I zoned out on you, Deepak. Yeah, it's real simple.
It's
early. Agents are a big conduit to all professional sports, and we've had several examples. You got a giggle earlier, Deepak, of this, so I won't name the agent or the player, but it was a power agent, and he heard when we were in Utah that there was a chance that we could trade for him, and he called me and he said, "Dennis, please, don't do it. He's a diva, and you and I will be the most miserable human beings on the face of the earth for the next year, so don't do it. So in making light of the situation, but it's not only information from a standpoint and limitations of who you can get, but many times in certain markets it's who you can keep. And it's a big constraint of ours.
Yeah. What about other stakeholders? You have owners, you have the league, any of these, you have star players on your team. Are they ever placing any constraints on what you can and can't do that might not be so obvious?
Owners putting constraints? No, yeah, there's definitely, I mean, owners will put constraints on you. They might say, hey, we don't want to go into tax this year for whatever reason, and that's going to put a constraint on in terms of what you're able to get done if they're not willing to pay the tax. And then the other thing could be is we're willing to pay the tax, but we have to be good enough to pay the tax. We have to be good enough to win. And so when you're going to make moves that will incrementally make you better but not good enough to win, then a lot of times you're going to say, okay, we're going to keep our powder dry, wait till next year, wait till this summer before we really go all the way in.
I think it might be important for people to understand how decisions are really made at pretty much most sports teams. I won't, it's not all, but there is somewhat often a perception of that there's a lead decision maker, a Monte, a Nico, that, has a team of people, but then just makes a decision and you just go off. And it's really almost never like that. That might happen with maybe a minor move, but on any significant move, it's more of a dialogue. It's a conversation among all these key stakeholders where hopefully if it's done well in that decision-making unit, there's input from all the important people. If there's people on different sides of it, there's information presented, there's sides talked about. And while you and the lead just might make a recommendation like, hey, this is the direction we think we can go, you better be ready to justify it. And if you're about to go in a direction you don't think is a good idea, your job is to convince people not to do it. And sometimes I feel like when there are those pressures that people try to absolve their responsibility by saying, oh, there was all these pressures, that's why that bad move happened. But the reality is our job is actually also to be the ones convincing the key people that, hey, whether that be the media, best players, owners, the agents of the players, that this is the right move for everybody. That is maybe one of the biggest parts of the job now.
And who's easiest to convince and who's hardest?
I can add a little bit. It's a great point, Daryl. And all of us coming from a San Antonio tree, Deepak, have been trained in negotiation training by Ron Shapiro. His influence in the league, Sam Presti, Danny Ferry, it goes on and on with Ron. And several of us didn't grow up inside of a typical management background or a legal background. So the negotiation piece makes us very nervous. So Ron was very key. And a big point that Ron embedded in us and when we did the training really struck home is the biggest piece of a negotiation, especially bigger deals, is your internal negotiation. It's 90% of it. It's negotiating to your owner. It's negotiating to your star player. It's negotiating to your own management group, your coaching staff. Some of the biggest fights I've had to put out internally with conflict, and competition always breeds conflict, is the health performance versus the coaches. The coaches really want a player. Health performance says he's not healthy enough to take the ball on a nightly basis.
Well, and the player might have their own opinion on what should happen. And yeah,
absolutely. So that internal piece is really you can't go to market with a unified message unless you have your group somewhat. In our last trade deadline, Nico is a good example. Nico wasn't satisfied with where we were at as a group before he ever, made the calls and did a really good job of bringing us to a point where we could make a decision.
I would mention another key stakeholder that's probably developed in the last 10 to 15 years in the NBA is the key people around the best players. So if you imagine how important the best players are in our game, they're very rational, generally very smart folks as well, these players, or they don't get to the top of the league. It's not just talent. Generally, the top players in the league not just have talent, they have a drive and an intelligence that have put them at the top. And they rationally say, I'm making all this money. if I put a team around me, now I can do more, and that could be a workout guy, that could be a health guy, that could be a nutritionist. Those people also are very key influencers around the best player, and they often work with multiple players in the league. So it becomes a very complex space. Nico probably knows this the best, given your background of manage all the key influencers, honestly.
Yeah, and you asked which ones was the most important, and
Thank you for actually answering the question that was asked. I was going to have to repeat it.
I was just going to let these guys talk for a while. It really depends who's the squeaky wheel at the time, and I think it rotates, it changes. It's not always the star player, it's not always the owner, it's not always the coach, but it's going to be each one of those in different periods of time. So it's really like understanding where your organization's at and who's really the squeaky wheel, and who can you kind of calm down, get to neutral, and then who, if you can't calm them down, then maybe you have to do something.
Yeah.
Wait, what do you have to do?
You might have to make a trade.
Oh,
or trade them.
I thought you were figuring out how to separate them from the best players. Okay, I got you.
Well, that too.
Yeah.
That's high risk, though.
Yeah.
So Nico, I appreciate you first actually answering the question, but then you did use a separate crutch, which is it depends. But I think that seems reasonable, because at any given time, the person that's going to be the hardest to convince is just going to vary depending on the situation. Let's sort of move away from just identifying the stakeholders and some of the constraints that might exist and go in a direction that, Monte, you also already kind of hinted at, which is that interests can be different. You might have fans that want to see forward movement right now, but internally are thinking a little bit more for the longer term. And if you have a different time horizon, you might decide to do something very different than people want to see right now. Other kinds of interests or examples of situations where you found yourself doing something that makes perfect sense to you because of what you're trying to achieve, but maybe the fans or the media or folks that are talking about it on the outside don't fully get what it is that you're trying to get to.
I think there's a few different things. One is a lot of times we just have different information. The tracking data, there's some of it's public, but that's a huge part of how we're evaluating things. So there could just be a big difference in evaluation. There's obviously another big one I think is which the basketball panel talked about last time. We're able to talk the coach's language a little bit more, but you still don't know from the outside what the scheme was, what was expected, and so you may think one player is doing something right when really it's another player that's affecting that. So having the internal, kind of what your coaches are asking of these guys and who's actually doing it, that can also change the evaluation. So I think what fans see from the outside often lines up, but sometimes there could be some big differences.
Not to call on you again, Nico, but you faced it in a big public way at the end of last season.
Yeah, I did. With the Kyrie trade, a lot of people, they didn't really know Kyrie, and they knew what happened in Brooklyn, and his reputation wasn't that great, but I knew who the person was. I knew his character, I knew his core. I've known him since high school, I knew his family, so I was willing to take that risk because I knew who he was, and I knew what the public perception of him wasn't actually who he was, so I was willing to take that gamble because I knew his core.
Well, it sounds like there's also an arbitrage opportunity there then, right? So if everybody else sees it this way, but you happen to have information that makes it a little bit more valuable, you can get it on there.
I could either be the smart one or I could be the dumb one too.
Yeah.
But in this case, when you know somebody and you know their core, then you're willing to take that risk or that gamble, but you know enough information.
I was referencing, I've never seen play out so directly. You guys had to focus on the future at the end of last year. And your draft pick and things like that. And I've been in that situation where your best player's like, we need someone now, and you know that you're maybe not quite good enough to win the title this year. So you have to be the one who either convinces the best player, okay, we need to focus on the future a little bit, or just agree to disagree at some point. I'm assuming he likes who's on the team now with him. So.
He does like the people on the team.
Yeah.
And that's the balance. You have to give up something to get something, and it's a balance between tomorrow and today. And I think that's what we all kind of struggle with is, what are we willing to give up today for tomorrow, and vice versa.
Yeah. And it sounds like the interests and the constraints are sort of intertwined as well. So you know where you want to go, but there's a bunch of folks who want to do it differently, even internally. As you said, what's happening on your side of the table. In the world of negotiations, we often call that the shadow negotiation. What's actually happening behind the scenes on your side. And as you pointed out, that can often be more complicated than what's happening across the table from the other side. Shifting briefly now to the question of information. Again, Monte, you got us started thinking about information you may have access to that others don't actually have access to. And earlier, Dennis, you gave an example of that as well. You're hearing from an agent, listen, trust me, this is going to end up badly for you. That's not something you can report in the media. That's not something you can go to the fans and tweet about and saying agent X said player Y would be toxic to our organization. But you know that, and so you have to act on that. Other examples where you think that if the information flow was there, people on the outside would get a better sense of why it is that you're doing what you're doing, from any of you. Yeah.
I'll take it. I think early on in Daryl's career in Houston when he joined us, we were obviously on the forefront of data and software and personnel and analysis, and specifically what Monte said, there's information, particularly at that time, that we had that most teams didn't have, but certainly the public didn't have, and the Shane Battier trade. And Shane is one, he's got a room after him that we all love. We had great management scouting agreement, and Daryl had to explain to Leslie, because when you're watching the video, it's not like Shane's scoring 25 a game. A lot of Shane's game is a little bit like Rudy Gobert. It's what doesn't happen on the court. You put Shane out there and he's not getting a bunch of rebounds, but your defensive rebounding percentage is really high. He's really good defensively. He's moving the ball to the next man. He knows all the plays. So when Jeff and Daryl and the other key stakeholders were making this decision, really they had to explain it to Leslie, explain the data, that, hey, this is where we're going. And obviously it was very good for the Rockets at the time, and Shane was a great Rocket, and it was a good trade.
Well, I think what folks maybe miss is that when there are key stakeholders against a decision and you have to push them to that decision, whether it be an owner, a key player, even sometimes it's us in our role, we're being pushed there because our staff who are very good say, you're really missing out on this guy, you need to go do it. It adds a level of risk, right? So if you are pushing an owner to a decision, and I remember a particular one. Monte was there. I think Dennis had just left to San Antonio, where our starting point guard was Rafer Alston, and Kyle Lowry was the third string point guard in Memphis. We were not sure Kyle Lowry was going to be we just thought he was a really good player, and we didn't think Rafer's fit with the team. Very good player, went on to play in the NBA Finals the year we traded him. We just didn't think his fit was good with the team, and we had to bring the owner to that decision. And you have the newspaper saying, what the heck are they doing, trading your starting point guard? This guy's never played, he's too small. And it adds a level of risk, and especially early in your career, which I was in at one point, Dennis was in at one point, Nico and Monte are sort of there. It adds a real drama to deals when you're like, okay, is this the one I'm going to bet on? Because if you make a bet, especially early in your career, this is the move I'm going to stake and push people to, and it goes wrong, you might not be in the job for as long as you hope.
I think the other thing too is the locker room. We know our locker rooms, and in Dallas we're very we over-index on the locker room in terms of how everyone gets along and bringing people in and knowing who those people that you bring in, how is it going to disrupt the locker room, which ultimately is going to affect the play on the court. And you bring in a guy and you might have two other guys now looking over their shoulder because this guy's going to take their minutes, or this guy's more disruptive than what our locker room can handle. Yeah. And so I think if the public knew that, knew what our locker room looked like and what it would look like if we brought this player in, I think they would just get a different glimpse. And we have it, obviously. It's stuff that nobody can see, but we're around it every day, so we get, bird's eye view of it.
Yeah, great. I mean, if you think about this, first of all, thank you, Dennis, for actually tying what we're doing here to data analytics in some way, and Shane Battier is always a nice way to make that link. But it is the case that, if you're just looking at summary stats or you're looking at the things that are most visible on the stats line, people may not like someone, but you can see what else this person is bringing to the team. And Daryl, your point as well about what the team needs versus what people think is right in terms of an individual, or what's actually happening in the locker room. All of these things seem to be very much things that you are aware of that they may not be aware
Monty
of.
tried to bring the data in, you just missed it. So talked about his internal camera data, valuing players different. So
He's just not good at his job. Is that what you're saying? I didn't get money for response or rebuttal.
I will say, even though Daryl's throwing jabs at me, I'll give him credit because what he talked about with the Rafer Alston deal, we were in the middle of a 55-win season and we traded our starting point guard for somebody who was, I think, not even playing at the time to be our backup, and then we elevated Aaron Brooks to be our starter in the middle. And we've got veterans like Tracy McGrady and Yao Ming and Shane Battier still at the time. So that takes a lot of work leading up to the negotiation. And, that's where organizations can, make really strong decisions, but they're very tough.
last inside baseball on that move, because I think it matters, and I'd like to shout out someone who is key. So your head coach is, I understandably, if you were in the role, very nervous. You're about to trade your starting point guard in a 50, right? And we're basically selling him on a guy that he's heard mixed things. And there's a whole coaching, so speaking of other stakeholders, there's a whole coaching network that's pretty rational. They hear about how guys are in the locker room, things like that. It's actually a very helpful network, but sometimes, when you're trying to make a big move, you might have heard different things about Kyle. And we had Brett Gunning at the time, who happened to have coached him at Villanova, who could go to Rick and be like, I know you're nervous, but this guy, he's going to be worse. He's going to be good in the locker room, and he's probably going to be a lot better than you think. And those kinds of conversations push a deal to the end, when if Rick at the time had really said pound the table, this is crazy, then that deal maybe doesn't happen.
Yeah. I think what's really interesting that's kind of happening, there's a bit of an undercurrent, especially in what you just said now, Daryl, what Nico said earlier about the Kyrie trade. Every decision you make is probabilistic. And the world is full of outcome bias. So if it works out great, you're a hero. If it works out poorly, you're a villain. But what's happening when you're making the decision ex ante is just your analysis and the information you have. And in a world where they don't get to see that, they don't get to see the process, they don't see how hard you're working at it, and they're only seeing the outcome, there is a bit of a roll of the dice. And I think that seems pretty clear. We're going to transition a little bit, and I'm going to ask each of these folks to think about something a little bit more specific related to this topic of what's happening behind the scenes. And we're going to roll up our sleeves a little bit. I'm going to start with Daryl. I'm going to ask Daryl to consider a situation, completely hypothetical. You have a player on your roster. They don't want to play for your team.
Oh, here we go. Okay.
Everybody wants them out.
You need a hug, Daryl?
Hey, it's happened to all of us, Dennis.
Yes, it
I
has.
just picked Daryl out of a hat. They don't want to play for your team. They want out. Everybody else wants them out. You have a lot of pressure from the fans.
I think it's really sad. I don't
them
know
out
which,
right now. Yeah, exactly.
which one you're talking about. But,
No years will even be mentioned. How do you think of a situation where you're getting that pressure to do this right now, and everybody seems to be aligned that this is not going to work, a decision has to be made right now? How do you navigate that? What are the factors you're thinking about?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge in those situations is actually the media environment. So while media doesn't, and another stakeholder we've talked about, well, they don't obviously make a decision. To me, they almost are the oxygen or the gravity in the room. If you can't get key places to at least put your case out there so the fans can somewhat understand. Sometimes you literally can't let the fans understand, whether it's how they're in the locker room or your conversation, but sometimes you can at least get your case out there. This is why, even though this player wants to be on another team, and there can be various reasons for that, this is why we are not just doing it now, right? We have a bigger picture in mind. And sometimes things that seem radical externally, which is why you don't make a move immediately, seem very just normal internally, which is, especially going back to the Ben Simmons situation. We had come off being the first seed in the East. We were an extremely good team. Ben Simmons played at an extremely high level. a lot of Ben Simmons' value was sort of missed by the marketplace, in that I think he's the best defensive perimeter player I had ever had on a team. He was ridiculous. In fact, he gave Luka fits whenever we played Luka. And so it was just constantly going back to the data, going back to the things that are sort of ground truth, and saying, we can't lose our minds here. This guy is a really good player, and that also came up in the James Harden situation. You have to remind yourself, this is a very good player. Then specifically getting to the negotiations part of it, it does matter that even though the media is saying trade him, trade him, trade him every single day, it matters that you have a job to do. You're hired to represent the interests of the Philadelphia 76ers, and this is a very valuable player, and you have to make sure that you get the timing right, because there's a timing element to deals. You know this better than any, Deepak, given your research. So you want to get to where there's either multiple bidders or the other side is correctly convinced that you have the credibility that, okay, you're going to go through the pain, because the other side is gambling that, like, okay, the owner will cave, the pressure will come from the best player. So the pressure will come eventually where they will give away this very good asset for less than they should. And that's how a lot of deals happen in this league, so you have to fight it.
Great. Monty, thinking about in the room itself, you're negotiating a deal, and of course, a lot of it's happening on the phone or whatever else, but when you're in the negotiating room, what's happening in that situation, again, that you think is more relevant, that is more impactful, that plays a role that others might not see?
I think I'll first start internally, because I think Nico already said this, but the first thing we have to do is figure out what our internal position is. So, and I think the hardest thing for me going from, assistant GM with Daryl to GM is you kind of have to separate yourself. And so on one hand, I have my own opinion and my own thought of a player or how good they are. And then I have to kind of put on a different hat and kind of basically bring the room together. And since we're at a nerdy place here, we're a little bit like a K nearest neighbors algorithm. And so I'm one dot, but now the owner, the organization sets the goal, and now I've got my assistant GM, my scouts, my analyst, my coach, my owner, all these people, and my job is to bring that together and say, okay, now this is our internal evaluation. So that's step one. And then step two is, now we got to go to the market. You have this external thing, and for all of us, we're all trying to become some level of contender. And I guess one more kind of nerdy thing here is it becomes a big stopping problem. So I have a trade deadline. Here's the best things I can do, and I have to decide, do I do that now or do I wait? And the cost of waiting is I have fewer and fewer times that I can do something. The time may be running out depending on the age of your players. And so what is our internal evaluation of that? Then what do we think we may get in the future? And then make a decision as far as what we're getting from the market.
Yeah. It's a bit like the game Taboo, where you can't say certain words, but once the other side has said it, you can then start using that word. So in the James Harden situation, for example, you see the same kind of thing, that if you don't have the internal sort of folks all aligned, and different people in the organization had very, very different stopping rules, reservation values, here's what we're willing to do it at, and you're trying to come up with one as an organization. Meanwhile, the other side is trying to guess where exactly you're going to cave and who's going to have that pressure as well. And I think this goes back to the point that was made earlier, that if you're not fully aligned, Dennis, maybe this was yours or Nico, I forget, if you're not fully aligned as a group, you're going to be leaking information the other side might actually be able to benefit from.
That's right, yeah.
Thank you.
Good point. Thank you. It's like you're a professor.
Why they pay me the big bucks.
I will say on that, Deepak, since Daryl didn't elaborate for you, but we do talk a lot. When we are in that room, give your opinion, and we hash it out. The second we walk out, that is now the organization's opinion, and that means that's what I have to represent in trade. That's what coach has to represent on the floor. Hey, if we get this guy or we do this, we're going to play this way. Our scouts, our analysts, everybody, we now represent to the outside that singular opinion, because otherwise, you see fraction or that can cause issues. So inside the room, hash it out. Outside the room, we're one.
I think both with Harden and Simmons too, there were limited possible buyers, if you might say. I think with Harden it was absolutely one-to-one. With Simmons it was extremely narrow and probably would have to be a multi-team type deals to make it a larger. And so a big part of it is convincing that you are one of the bidders almost, like that holding could be, and that means setting, and mapping out that scenario and setting the reservation price or your BATNA, I guess, to use the terms from your field. So setting that becomes very important, and setting like, hey, below this we won't go. It turns out if you set a reservation price, it turns out to be very hard to even share with some of your staff, because that's the kind of information that is so nuclear that it's probably something you're only sharing with one or two owners at the most, because that information can be really used against you.
Yeah, and there might be people that are well-meaning in your organization who know that you're willing to do a deal at X, even though you're representing you need 2X. And they're going to go ahead and maybe mention it in some way to the other side just to try to get the deal done because they think they're doing some good.
Yes.
And that can be potentially problematic. And again, it comes down to, are we going to be united when we negotiate, even if we're fighting when we're preparing for it? And certainly in the rooms that I've been in, when you're strategizing, whether it's a board meeting or a strategy meeting and a negotiation or anything, what I find very, very impressive is when you have leaders who can create an environment where you're not rewarding people in the room for coming up with the right answer, but rather you're rewarding them for coming up with good arguments. Because you need a lot of good arguments to come up with a decent answer. And then once that answer is there, you can go out there and sort of run with it. But too often you have rooms where everybody's just taking a position and they're defending it, and this is the right answer, and this is the right answer, rather than being a little bit more flexible and thinking about pros and cons of every position, including their own. And I think that kind of probably shows when you're done.
Yeah, well, there's.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Nico.
There's also something pretty interesting about getting alignment in that room, is that this is real time. So you can get alignment in that room and lose 3 games in a row, and now there's different pressures coming.
This is
at
a
you.
really good point.
Whether it's from the coaches or the owners, because now there's a different pressure than there was, a week ago when we all were aligned.
Yeah.
And so that will change your alignment, and now you have to rethink it and maybe even have a different negotiation.
I love Nico said that, because you'd be shocked at how much like one game can make. You're like close on a deal, it's like a 55-45 deal, and then like the team wins or loses. I have a good example. Monte was there, where we had won 12, I think it was 12 in a row. We still felt like we needed to make a trade. The trade deadline happened in the middle of it, and we made a trade for Bobby Jackson. It wasn't a trade done. It was basically like the structure of a deal was set, and then the trade deadline was the next day. New Orleans played that night, and Bobby hit 7 threes. And we were actually quite concerned that they were going to be like, you know what, we changed our mind. This guy is really, and that actually really happens, where they go like to the owner and like, oh, I was there last night. It was awesome. We can't do this.
Bit of a recency
Or your own player hits 7 threes.
Oh, your own player.
I wanted to get rid of him, but he's really good now.
Guilty.
Give an example, Nico.
So Nico, I'm going to leverage a different aspect of your experience for those of you who don't know. Nico, before he was in the NBA, even though he has a basketball background, spent 19 years, was it, at Nike, doing all sorts of corporate deal making, sponsorship deals, partnership deals. How does negotiating in the NBA, talking about players, et cetera, differ or not differ so much from the kinds of deals you were doing before?
Yeah, so I think, one thing in the NBA, there's rules. So when you're dealing with athletes, there's rules. At Nike, if I'm the most aggressive, if I have the best relationship, I can there's no rules. When you're dealing with like the NWSL or the NBA, or you're dealing in a partnership, there's no emotions. The people on the other end might be emotional, but there's no emotions. But from player to player, it's actually the same. If it's an individual shoe deal or an individual contract, there's emotions involved. It's really not the money. No. It's what the money represents and where the money is in the continuum of what everybody else is getting paid. Mm-hmm. So I think there's some commonalities when it's player to player. Mm-hmm. It's just different when you're dealing with a body, that you're doing a deal with, because there's no emotion.
Yeah.
And so that makes it a lot easier, I think. And then again, there's also emotional people on the other side. But when you're doing a deal with the NWSL or USA Basketball or the NBA, there's no emotion to that.
Yeah, it's not somebody's life that you're dealing with right there.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Deepak, Nico's being humble. It's what we do. We negotiate, and he's relatively new to the GM seat, and he's able to deliver a very strong, clear message and be non-pulsed. And I actually asked him about it, and I don't know if you can share it or not, Nico, he told me about LeBron and the jersey number change. And he's had to have tough conversations with LeBron and Chris Paul and all these guys relative to their gear and footwear. And because of that, you could just tell that he's dealt with big budgets and big personalities, and it fits really well into what we do as well.
And also the point that you made.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. See, Daryl, people can build each other up. There are other ways of engaging.
I'll make fun of Daryl.
But there is something, not to be missed here, I think, the idea that what you think you're negotiating might be money, but really for the other person it might be status or how they're going to be perceived or what this says about them. And sort of understanding that is going to be true in a shoe deal as much as it might be true in what's happening here. What did I get traded for, et cetera?
Most of the deals are status in the NBA. Like, it's really just the guys between minimum and maybe the mid-level where it's the money that swings their decision. But a lot of them, it's like, I want to get paid this because that makes me the 5th highest paid player or the first 5, those kinds of things.
Well, I mean, we won't mention names, but there was a situation where part of the argument to player X was, do you really want to be traded for so little and be seen as that's all we were able to get for you? That doesn't make you look good either, right? So when you're trying to manage all these different stakeholders, you're trying to use every lever you have to do it. Dennis, I'm going to give you the last question before we go to a quick rapid fire round, and then we'll go to the audience. You've been on a number of different teams. You've been on the Rockets, you've been on Utah, you're now advising Dallas, others.
San Antonio.
San Antonio. What do you see being sort of table stakes? Everybody does negotiations the same way. Versus where is there sort of a room for finding alpha, where there's a margin for being better than everybody else? Like everybody has to play by the same rules, right? Everybody has a certain size staff, et cetera. They all have certain things that are common. Where do you see across organizations where some can be better or worse when it comes to the front office?
Yeah, so the commonalities are, I think, I've been fortunate to have worked with literally Hall of Famers and guys that, like R.C. Buford, that will be in the Hall of Fame. I think Daryl's going to be a Hall of Famer with what he did with Houston and Philadelphia and what he's doing with influencing our game and how it's played, to be frank. So Kevin O'Connor was the best senior advisor anybody could have. Just amazing coaches, and really all 4 organizations I can honestly say are really values-based. We don't lie, we don't leak. You can't ever be lazy inside of negotiations. One thing I always appreciated Daryl, his acumen and capacity was great, but he was going to be new to the job, but he was going to run out every trade call. We were going to run out and maximize the rules. Anytime Gerson Rosas called me from Houston and he's like, Denny, hey, I'm running out a fly ball here. I was like, okay, tell me what BS Daryl has right now. So, but with that said, every organization's different. Look, Houston and Dallas are relatively big market. If you get Hakeem Olajuwon, you're going to get Clyde Drexler. If you get Clyde Drexler, there's a good chance Charles Barkley and his agent are going to make his way there. And if you get, if Clyde retires, you're going to get Scottie Pippen in a sign and trade. And it goes on to Yao Ming, drafting Yao Ming and having Steve Francis in place, and Daryl takes over, and then all of a sudden you can get Tracy McGrady that Carol Dawson made a trade on. And so same thing with Dallas. Nico and Mark are in alignment, and new ownership are in alignment, especially with Luka being just an unbelievable offensive talent, that they can think big inside that market. Not that we can't think big in San Antonio, in Utah, but we got to think big within our certain realities. Thinking big and being fundamental are really important, and so we got to value draft picks more. If we're going to do bigger trades, it's going to be more draft day trade. Kawhi Leonard for George Hill, Rudy Gobert moving into the draft, Donovan Mitchell, because what I said earlier is it's not only the players that you can trade for, but it's what you keep. So if you think about it, you know, at a baseline level, geography, demographics matter to every organization. And then dominant personalities, your star player. Leslie Alexander, our owner with the Houston Rockets, he was a trader by nature. If you go back and you look at the volume of trades that Rudy Tomjanovich, Robert Barr, Carol Dawson did as the lead decision makers, they always thought big. Daryl kind of doubled down on that. RC, Pop, thinking more fundamental, draft, development, and then you mix in a Kawhi Leonard and a bigger trade. In some ways, in Utah, we had a similar dynamic. You have a similar dynamic as well going on with OKC and Sam Presti, where he's operating very aggressively just within the realm of his reality. And if you don't embrace reality, and you don't embrace it, as Kevin O'Connor said, a year early and as soon as possible, and you're the last one to know on wanting a player to stay, you're always going to get leveraged at the poker table.
Yeah, I like the sort of juxtaposing both. There are different individuals with different experiences and approaches to deal making, negotiations, risk taking, et cetera, but also there are different realities, and understanding that what worked there won't work here, not because of anything else other than we're just a different kind of organization or a team or a market.
Right.
It seems great. All right, we're going to do just a few minutes of fun rapid fire questions. Daryl, usually I have to remind you during the rapid fire question, just answer the question. So I'll just do it up front so we don't have to pause in the middle. Where should we start? Let's start with something fun. This section is called "I'm Awesome, I Suck." It's a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is I'm awesome at this, and 1 is I suck at this. So I'm going to give you a characteristic, a trait, and you're going to just rate yourself. 10 is the highest, 1 is the lowest.
Are there audience questions?
If we go to audience, please ask I'm awesome, I suck questions. Okay, how good are you? Or awesome are you at listening to people in your organization who have a very different point of view from you? Monty, we'll go this way, then we'll come this way the next time. Monty?
I think that's one of my better things.
Just give me a number, man. Come on.
9.
I'll say 8.
9.
8.
All right. How good are you at statistics and data analytics? You personally, not your team. Start that way.
To be completely humble.
No, honest.
4.
Okay.
9.
3.
8.
All right, great. See, we need to get some variance, so I have to throw that in there. Okay, you're in a really desperate deal situation. That's the scenario. You have very little leverage. How good are you at hiding your desperation from the other side?
5.
9.
5.
That was never a big issue. 8, 9.
Okay, great.
Sense of theme.
How good are you at figuring out how far you can push the other side or whether they're bluffing? Go this way.
I'd separate it.
Yeah, okay.
So push.
Sure.
So bluffing, I can suss that out pretty good. 8. Push the other side. It's not my general nature. The pretty please, Deepak never works in negotiations. So I'd say 5.
That in your class? Don't go pretty, please.
We start day 1 is don't say pretty please. And that gets them to the first week.
I'll stick with the bluffing. 8. Yeah.
Bluffing? Yeah.
7.
I'll say 7.
All right, pretty good. Okay.
Just
How good
a
are
real
you?
Quick thing there. The league is so tight. It's like a sewing circle.
Yeah.
Well, you can't really bluff your way in the
Okay,
league.
well, that's good to know. See, people may
Yeah.
not know that. How good are you at telling people they're wrong?
3.
I was taught to tell people they're wrong but make them feel right, so I'll say 9.
Okay, so you've gotten good at it.
Yes.
All right, Monty, you're going to
I'm going to go to Nico's
You're going to
class.
go to Nico, yes.
10.
Whether
I
they're
can
wrong or
attest to
not,
that.
it turns out.
I enjoy it. It's a character flaw.
In fact, yeah, you usually start by telling people they're wrong and then seeing what they have to say.
It's a character flaw. Yeah.
Dennis.
That's great.
You skipped. You didn't answer.
Oh, I was going to pass on that.
All right,
Yeah, it's not a big issue for me either, 9.
okay. Now, reverse it. How good are you at admitting you're wrong?
0. My wife's out there. She'll raise her hand.
Fact checkers in the audience. Good.
I have to separate it. If I'm actually wrong, 10.
So the next question is going to be about how
If
self-aware.
I'm not wrong,
Yes.
1.
But if you are wrong,
If I'm wrong, 10. I think.
you have no problem with it.
Definitely not.
Yeah, if I'm wrong, 10.
Yeah.
I don't know. My staff's there, so they could.
Just throw out a
10.
number. It's like a.
I'd say 10. I think that's one that we're good at.
Okay, I'm just going to give you one other question, which goes back to the theme here about behind the scenes. Just give me an overestimate or underestimate. Those are the two options. From your point of view, do fans overestimate or underestimate the following things? All right, so how much you can influence the team's success in an upcoming season? Do you think fans overestimate or underestimate? Just rough sense. Go, quick.
Over.
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 All right. How much the league can influence, the league office can influence what happens in trade negotiations?
Over.
They overestimate it? Okay.
Pass.
Under.
Consider that an under.
Way under.
I agree with Daryl.
Okay, so they play a much bigger role than people might assume.
They could.
They could. Can.
Yes.
It was right. It can influence.
Well, and to be fair to them, they have a role.
Yeah, listen, this is not, that's fine. How badly GMs themselves personally want to win a championship?
Under.
Oh,
Do fans,
over.
The fans overestimate or underestimate how badly you want to win a championship?
Oh, under. Yeah.
Under.
Yeah, my bad. Under.
Okay.
Under.
All right. Overestimate or underestimate how hard the job of a GM is?
Under.
Under.
I would say over.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, just like
It's not that hard.
you know,
Yeah.
we're not like doing real jobs. Like, right? This is, yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with Daryl. It's what we do is not that important, but at times it can be difficult.
Yeah.
But it's under.
Right. All right. We're going to go to audience questions, assuming this does its job. It appears to be doing its job. All right, we're going to audience questions. I don't see any on here. That could be a problem. Is this needing to be? Oh, there you go. It just showed up. All right. Are there teams you avoid doing deals with because you think they may have an edge over you? And I'll add something to it, or you don't trust them, or any such thing. Or are you sort of indifferent to the kind of team you're dealing with?
It's hard to avoid a team.
Yep.
I do like to. Where's Fan Hall? I'd like to call Fan Hall instead of Daryl from now on because of how Daryl negotiates sometimes. But
Jeez.
no, it's yeah. There's
You
29.
do call Fan Hall.
There's 29 teams, and for the most part, it's a repeating game, and everybody is knows that what you do now is going to affect you in the future. So it's pretty easy to work with those teams. There may be one every now and then, but.
Yep. Anybody else want to weigh in on that one?
Yeah, I would add, look, it's like every team also is pretty confident in what they're doing. So it's like, I don't think teams really avoid working with teams. There's only 29 others. Sometimes you wish there were more teams. You're like, we need more teams to like find possibilities. So.
Yeah.
All right. Sports, I'm just going to read it the way it's written. Sports, unlike business, is a closed network and only has one champion every year. Considering most people don't get to win every year, how do you measure?
Champions. Shout out
That's
in-season tournament.
There you go. Thank you. Shout out to Evan, wherever he is. Considering most people don't get to win every year, how do you measure success for yourself?
Oh, good question.
Got a couple of answers would be good.
I'm still trying
run
to
out
figure
the
it out. I'm new.
You're new, you're trying to figure it out. Okay, so you're still looking for a success metric. Those of you who've been around a lot longer?
I mean, it's the natural process thing, and I think with us, we have to take more risks than maybe a business does, and so just evaluating yourself, knowing that those risks may not pan out.
Okay, so evaluating your process and being comfortable with the risks.
I'll answer it another way because we have a staff of people, and so for me, like, how do we develop our team? Who are you able to to move up the ranks and develop and get better. And, you know, you can look at the players as well. You know, who can you develop as players that they might leave and go off and get paid because you guys developed them? Because there's only one champion, and, you know, you may never win one. It doesn't mean you suck.
I would say there's internal goals set. You know, everyone knows you're trying to win a title, but there are teams like 24 teams on average start the year with 0 chance to win the title. So if you're just saying like this year we win the title or we're a failure, it would be depressing. So especially there, we were rebuilding after Yao got hurt and Tracy got hurt. We talked about developing our habits and, you know, making our transition game better, making sure the shell of our defense was improving and on a good improvement path, making sure that a young player who we thought was here and worth the 20th pick in the draft is now worth the 15th pick. So you have to set these little internal goals, or otherwise, yeah, you just like go back to the tub and end it. If you're one of these teams
Please
that
strike
goes
that
in.
comment from the online streaming and recording.
We all know, like, all these teams start the year with no chance. So it's like,
Daryl, I'll let Monty give you mouth to mouth. I'm not doing it.
I think it's time to move on to the next question. This might go somewhere. When negotiating with free agents, what are some examples of unconventional deal terms or negotiating levers you've used to get a deal done? Anything that come to mind that's sort of creative, interesting, different?
I'll start there. Sometimes a few deal points aren't what maybe even the agent and the player and the media think. We got in, it's been mitigated with a collective bargaining agreement extension, but we wrote a lot of incentives. Mm-hmm. And for me, incentives provided 2 key pieces. Anytime I got an agent negotiating on an incentive, I could go to my owner and say, hey, we're getting close. Very rarely did an incentive break a deal. So it was a good tell as much as anything. And then for us, we did a lot of body fat and off-season bonus incentives. And of course, we all want our players to be in great shape. But frankly, I was never concerned about that. A big dilemma for us in Salt Lake City, because we weren't going to be able to go to the market and get the rock star free agent, so we had to draft well and develop. I had Quinn Snyder, I had a really good development staff in Utah, a great practice facility, altitude to train in. So if I could get the players back to the practice facility, and if you think about it, body fat bonuses, well, you're going to do your body fat test in Salt Lake City. And if I had that in Salt Lake City Summer League, they're coming back, and they're not going to come back for 24 hours to take a body fat. They're going to come back and work my coaches. So sometimes, you know, you can figure out the lay of your land and optimize best, and not every incentive is exactly what it's meant to be as it's been written, as an example.
let's just hope the body fat doesn't go to the front office next.
Yeah, fungible body fat. Okay. So I'll interpret this question slightly differently just so we can get through it more quickly. I guess what percentage of what is reported by the media in a contract negotiation trade is objectively accurate versus subjective interpretation? So how much, you can answer it with like a percentage or high, low, like generally do you think they're getting what's happening behind the scenes, the media? Because we're sort of shifting from the fans to what the writers are writing about. Quick reactions.
I think it depends who the media is. You know?
Stop giving me depends.
Well, the reason why is
I get it. Give me a range.
If it's a guy that's near your team, they usually have a good idea what's going on in your team. If it's a person in LA, they probably don't know as much.
Yeah. Okay. So the local people probably have a pretty good read on what's happening, reporting more or less objective.
Yeah.
Great.
And Woj. Seems like whenever Woj says something, it's pretty accurate.
Yeah. So on Woj, we were working on a deal with a player, and he was like, well, we didn't have a deal. Woj didn't even tweet it, and I was like, you do realize that that's not whether Woj tweets it is not. I would say, yeah, I mean, Nico's obviously right. I would say that a shocking amount is inaccurate, which is really frustrating. And there's even a law, you might know the law because you're a professor, like Herfindahl's law or something like that. Even in if your industry, you know it's completely inaccurate, you still believe everything in other industries. So, yeah.
And a big frustration I would add to that is the regurgitation of articles, where one article that may be 10% inaccurate, repeated 3 or 4 times, can be 90% inaccurate. That's something, and we have to deal with that.
Yeah.
We have to deal with that.
Yeah. That's right. As we close off, I'll just throw one last question out there. If you have to pick one person on the panel to negotiate on the opposite side of, who would you pick and why in like one sentence or less? So a huge high stakes negotiation. One of these folks is going to be on the other side. Who would you want there?
I would say Nico. I like talking to him the best of this group.
Okay.
Dennis, a close second.
I actually, and I'm going to continue that, and I would say Daryl because he doesn't care.
He doesn't care about, can you finish the thought? He doesn't care.
Not that he doesn't care, but he's like, you know, he's going to get to the point.
Oh, okay, got it. So he's not going to get emotional. He's not getting wrapped up in it.
Yeah, we're not going to talk about the family and all that. He's just
the family that's sitting right here, right in front.
no, not that he doesn't love his family, but we're going to.
This is the best way to end a panel. It's not that Daryl doesn't love his family.
We took them. We're rolling the bus over 3 or 4 times.
I think that tub is coming back into the picture. Okay, Daryl, who do you pick?
I would say Dennis because you can just break it down pretty quickly. Like, yeah, it's just, you know, you're trying to do something in the future. We're trying to do something.
Get to the facts.
Yeah, pretty straightforward. Yeah.
Nico, I'm into self-preservation. He's my boss. And then Monty and Daryl are a tie.
Oh, okay, got it. Excellent. All right. I want to thank the panelists for spending the time with all of us and sharing their insights and their perspective on things. And the hope is that if you came here for something that was either entertaining or insightful or perhaps just you're curious, you got something out of it as well. I don't know what the plan is next for all of you. You might be running off, but have a great day. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and thank you for coming.